All right, everyone. Welcome to MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We are one day away from football. No games on Thursday night. The NFL took over with the opener against Green Bay and Chicago. Gave us no college football. And, of course, if you've listened to my scheduling approach, my fix to the current issue with college football scheduling, both in conference and out of conference, we fixed that. You would not go a Thursday night without a decent college football game. We also have a bunch of garbage games tonight. Really, almost nothing tonight in regards to watchable football, and that wouldn't happen with our schedule approach. But welcome to MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We're going to get you set for Saturday. And this is a feature that we had running each and every week last college football season on through after the college football season. We took over with the NFL playoffs and through the Super Bowl with Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. So I'm awaiting Steve's arrival. We have not connected for quite some time since we knocked out some videos during the offseason talking about national championship odds, Heisman Trophy odds, and betting lines. But man, Steve is a wealth of information, and this is one of the segments during the week, during the college football season that I look forward to the most because I'm just intrigued by the betting lines, the angles, the odds, and some of those factors that sway the lines and the public opinion factor into it. We've got a couple people on the line. And again, I'm awaiting Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. So hopefully we get him on the line very soon. But in the meantime, let's look at college football for a week 2 and talk about the betting approach and the odds approach to college football and what happened in week 1. Well, in week 1, we had how many double-digit favorites go down? And it started actually in week 0 when Arizona traveled out to Hawaii. And what most people who follow college football, like you, like me, anticipated was a close game. And that's what we got. So Arizona, as an 11-point favorite, was a bit ridiculous. They ended up losing by a touchdown. And that started off the double-digit favorites losing. And we had a number of those during week 1. It's MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. So today your lineup is Steve Merrill coming up in just a few minutes from Pro Sports Info, and I'll stay on the line to take your calls at 860-325-3687, and we'll get the number posted. And then after Steve joins us at 1 o'clock, we got Pete Garrison talking USC football as the Trojans take on Stanford. And then at 2 o'clock Eastern time, we're talking Nebraska football with Greg Peterson from Husker Online and Rivals. And I will be taking your calls through the next few hours. Hey, Steve, how you doing today?
Doing well. I'm not sure why the lighting isn't working out here, but if it gets too bad, I'll just kick off the cam. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. It's just so we can hear you, most of all. Not that we don't want to see you, because we definitely do, because it's been a long time. How you been?
Doing well, doing well. Excited that college football is back.
Absolutely. The college football's back. And I don't know if you could hear my opening remarks, but I've been taken back by, not that it's a big surprise, but maybe I missed some opportunities with week 0 and especially week 1 and the double-digit favorites that went down. Missouri at Wyoming, South Carolina against North Carolina, Nevada knocking out Purdue. I probably missed a couple. Week 0 was Hawaii. It's an 11-point underdog taking out Arizona. So let's start right there in regards to the value that you saw, and we'll see maybe in the future of some of these double-digit home underdogs from some of the Group of 5 conferences taken into the big boys.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually played mostly huge favorites in week 1 and did quite well. In fact, the only game I lost last week as a big favorite was Michigan. They got it done but didn't cover. But I had LSU 55-3, had Clemson covering the big number on Thursday. So I actually was able to pick some spots, and I basically looked for spots where I thought the underdogs could not play from behind. For example, that LSU game, Georgia Southern, an option attack, they can't play from behind. That was a nice blowout winner. In fact, the only underdog I used in week 1 was Oregon +4, and we know how that turned out. Covered from start to finish until the final play of the game, basically. So I do like to look for the blowouts in week one. I stayed away from any of those games you mentioned, luckily. Some of them are fluky. Look at Purdue. They had a 5-0 turnover deficit, and their 11-point loss. As an 11-point favorite, lost outright at Nevada, but a 5-0 turnover deficit had a lot to do with that. And keep in mind, there is no preseason in college football. We have 18, 19-year-olds playing their first game with basically no exhibition game. So some strange things always happen in week one. Week two here will be obviously a key time to take a look and see which results were legitimate from week one and which ones are just flukes.
Yeah, I wish I would have stayed with my own barometer that we talked about a number of times last year, because it's been my observation over the last 2 years in keeping track of my own picks that go back to 1982, but I never really measured them like I have the last couple seasons, that you can almost bank with a full slate of games that about 20 to 25% of the games are going to be upsets. So you got to find the upsets. And obviously, one of the plays I made, and the only upset play that I made last week, was Boston College was a 5.5-point underdog at home against Virginia Tech. I loved BC in that spot. They won by a touchdown. So my one upset pick pulled through, but I should have looked for a few more. I certainly considered South Carolina and North Carolina as a prime target. Just your thoughts about trying to find that value. And I know that you've told us in the past, hey, if that point spread's in the 3 to 4 range, under maybe 6, you may want to think about taking the money line if you're really that sure that that team's going to be able to cover as an underdog, that you're gonna make value there if you go ahead and just take the money line and take your underdog pick to win it outright.
Yeah, there's no question that if it's a line of a touchdown or less, and the numbers I look at are more NFL numbers, but it holds up in college football as well. I know in the NFL, for example, if you pick the straight up winner and the spread is 7 or less, about 83% of the time you're going to have the point spread winner. So what it's saying is only about 17% of the time is a team going to win but not cover as a touchdown favorite or less. So if you like an underdog at +4, +6, you better think they're going to win the game outright, because basically 5 out of 6 times they're going to have to do so. Otherwise, the spread's not going to matter. So, yeah, you want to look for live dogs in that touchdown range or less. When you start getting to the double-digit range, obviously it's a different story, and it becomes more so, can the favorite pull away, or can the underdog have some backdoor cover potential? And as I mentioned earlier, what I looked for in week one were really blowout games in which not only did I think the favorite was going to win big, but I thought the underdog did not have backdoor cover potential. But that's a different story. Point line or less. Really, at that point, you want to try to pick the straight up winner.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We've got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. We'll get you more on his product in just a second. I want to remind you that down in the description section below, now because this is a live stream, I'm going to have to add it later. The default settings in YouTube are what they are. So for my recorded videos, you're going to see down in the description section below a link to my Voice of College Football community. Voice of College Football community. Grab that link. You sign up. You get my predictions every week. 16 and 11 against the spread, 59%. And Steve, I've told you in the past, this is probably not the best approach, but I pick all the top 25 games, plus all the games that I feel are relevant, like a North Carolina, South Carolina, and I just hold myself to that standard. So it probably brings down the percentage, but I'll still take 16 and 11 against the spread, 26 and 2 money line last week. And then also we've got the offer for you that I'll post here on the screen in just a second, that if you go to betnow.eu, we've got a partnership with them going right now that involves some YouTubers. It's for a worthy cause. You see the hashtag down there, support Sam Strong. And basically you get 100% added to your account if you do your bets there. You use the promo code MRTVCFB, but where you want to get your information, sure, you can listen to me. I do well against the spread. I do well, but there's a reason I got Steve on here every week. And hopefully with 3 times the audience we had at this point last year, Steve, this was just one of my favorite segments each and every week, because Steve's knowledge and insight into this for doing it for decades is just remarkable. And I'm fascinated and could keep you on here forever. So before we dive into more football, Steve, if you could explain to everybody the information and the service that you provide there at Pro Sports Info.
Yeah, I've been doing this now for 24 football seasons, over half my life. Started in 1996. So this is the 24th football season. I've been analyzing college and pro football. And basically what I do is I look for games that have a mathematical edge. It's that simple. The point spread is the great equalizer, as we all know, and it's gotten sharper and sharper since I started 24 years ago. But one thing is certain: there's always games each week where there's an edge. And when you have 50 college football games, you can find those 3 or 4. And like you said, Mark, it's tough picking all the top 25s playing 25, 30 games because a lot of those games really don't have a mathematical edge. So to have a winning record against the spread near 55, 60% like that is actually very solid. And I totally agree with you there. And what I do for my clients is I try to find those 3 or 4 games each Saturday and each Sunday in the NFL where I think the odds are off, several points. And that gives us a long-term edge. We're going to hit about 60%. You're going to win a lot of money hitting 60%. Yet those guys saying we have 80, 90% winners. You might do that over a 10-game sample, but that's not going to hold up long-term. But yeah, you hit 55, 60% over the course of the season. You'll make a nice little profit. And these are the exact same plays I'm personally using each day. And it'll be the 24th football season that I've done so for my clients.
Folks, anytime you go online and see somebody who says they pick 83% against the spread or some ridiculous number like that, actually just follow their site week to week. They can say whatever they want and make up their record or do whatever they want, but actually track the picks for a long time. And certainly what Steve does is amazing, and he's got the track record to back it up. What I do is simply, I'm just a guy that watches a ton of football and just absorb it and have picked up a little bit here and there. I'm no expert. This is not what I do in regards to odds making and handicapping. That's why I bring the professional on here, but I just do it for fun, and I know a little bit and do fairly well, but it's just entertainment purposes only, we will say, wink, wink. At the same time, Steve provides us with great insight. So I will bring your comments and questions on here as well. We'll let Steve stay on here for as long as he has some time, but what we did last year was basically just kind of kick around the trends and the things that stood out from the previous week and what we were looking ahead to this week. And then Steve would give us maybe kind of a play on something in particular. And Steve will certainly do that going forward, starting next week. Whatever you're prepared to do this week is great. But is there anything that you caught in week one? And I brought up the double-digit underdog edge that seemed to be there. Now it's always easy, and this is another psychological game. It's always easy for us to go into hindsight and say, yeah, I knew that was going to happen. Yeah, boy, we should have seen that or seen that. And then it's easy to say after the games have been played. But what other trends or have you seen in previous years that could be taken advantage of in the early season before Vegas has a complete hold on what the numbers game is?
Yeah, one thing over the years is I don't necessarily expect teams to bounce back after a really bad performance. There was an angle I used to track about 10, 15 years ago. It doesn't work quite as well now just because there's so many teams that have switched between FCS and FBS. But I know about 10 years ago when I was tracking it, when a team lost to an FCS team, an FBS team lost to a 1AA team, they were a play against the next game as well. And sometimes there's logic of, well, they bounce back as a really embarrassing loss, but it didn't always work that way. And more times than not, the team struggled in their next game as well. So teams that vastly underperformed in week one, you have to be very careful with. Now, sometimes they bounce back. I mentioned Purdue, an 11-point favorite at Nevada. They lose outright, but they had a 5-0 turnover deficit. I think that was more of a fluke than anything else. But teams that underperform or lose outright legitimately on the scoreboard and in the box score, they don't normally just fix their problems in 6 days for that next game. So be very careful with those teams. And I think you do want to look at week one results and kind of use those going forward until you see otherwise. Now, with that said, as I referenced earlier, there's no preseason college football. You're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, many of which have never played a game before. So you do have to take the week one results with a grain of salt. We do that in the NFL even. The results we see this Sunday will not correlate to the rest of the season for the most part. Year after year, the week one NFL results by far the most random of the entire season, other than week 17, maybe when guys are sitting and resting. It's the same thing with college football. I kind of take it in a different, I take September, October, November all differently. I really look at a 4-week segment for college football. I feel like at that point you can kind of dial in the statistical numbers and really use numbers more for October and November. But this time in September, you're really looking at matchups. You're looking at player personnel. And I thought week one, for the most part, played out like I thought it would, except for some of those fluky results. I keep referencing the Purdue-Nevada game just because of the turnovers, 5 turnovers, something I like to look for. I think those type of things even out in the long run. But when you see a team losing on the line of scrimmage, when you see a team getting outrushed by 100 yards, that's not something that's going to switch in the next week.
Yeah, so I just jotted down a few things that we certainly have covered in the past, but they need to be updated. There's a term that's thrown around a lot, And I kind of find myself in the role of checking people at times when they throw out outlandish terms and they don't define them. Like they ask me, who's going to have a breakout season? Well, define a breakout. Or who's a dark horse? Mark, give us your dark horses. And then they're taking teams that are already ranked in the top 10. And I'm like, that is not what I would consider a dark horse. Define a dark horse. So I hold people accountable here, Steve. The viewers and the callers and so forth. So this is a term that I hear all the time, and I believe it's legitimate. But I want to know from you as an expert what it means to you. People throw out the term, "This is a trap game. That's a trap game," and I understand the logic of we're dealing with psychology here. We're dealing with 18 to 21-year-old kids and what they're capable of doing week to week and getting themselves prepared for, and what they deem as a worthy opponent versus this is a big game, that's not a big game. And there's a lot of psychology there. Now, we're trying to second guess what that could be. Now, certainly a trap game could be after you're coming off a huge win over a big opponent, you could have a letdown. Or if you've got a big game, then another big game sandwiched in between, you've got a lesser opponent, that could be a trap game. But do we have any real data to verify that there are trap games? It's easy to see an eye and understand the psychology, but does it bear out statistically that teams get caught in trap games?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Mark, because that's probably the biggest pet peeve for me in my 24 football seasons has always been the trap game term. Because what I find ironic about it is most of the time when I've done shows over the years and the host will say, "Boy, I don't understand this line. It's about, I think this line should be 10. Why is it only 3? Must be a trap game." Not only do I always like hearing that because I like to know which way like the general public is looking, but more times than not over the last couple of decades, I've usually really liked the other team. So when there's a 3-point dog, I like that play. It's a contrarian play. The public, a lot of radio hosts out there think the line should be 10. They love the other side, and I already like the other side of them, and they think it's a trap game. Those are some of the strongest plays I come up with, actually. Yeah, I never really use the term trap. I like sandwich game. I think you just referenced that when you have a game kind of stuck between two major games, letdown spot. Something I use every week. In fact, college football, two of the biggest handicapping factors I look for are letdown spots and what I call sandwich games. And I guess a sandwich letdown spot would be a trap game, and that's basically what you're looking for. The other thing I'll point out about trap games is a lot of times, the odds makers are on the same side of the sharp bettors, and the public will be heavy on the other side. So if the public thinks the line should be 6 or 7, and it's only 3, the reason is probably because, the public likes that one side, but the heavier sharp money is coming in on the other side, balancing out the action. And that's a lot of times why you see games which look too good to be true to the novice bettor. But myself and a lot of professionals are usually on the other side, and those are some of the best plays I have during the course of the season.
Talking college football betting with Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info. So I would encourage you, when you get done with what we're doing here, or certainly just open up another tab, go to prosportsinfo.com, and see Steve's results and his logic and approach and his service right there. We had fascinating conversations for the last couple of years during college football season. Here's the other thing to take into consideration is it's one thing to have a decent record, money line or against the points. It's another thing to make it a profitable proposition or product. And so you delve into that as well in regards to educating people and actually executing yourself, the money distribution and how important that is as well.
No question. The key to winning is getting value with the number. People ask me, 3 weeks ahead of game time, who do you really like in this matchup? And I'll be like, it depends what the line is. Team A or B, I could play on either team if the line is wrong. I don't, I have situations I look for. I think there's maybe letdown spots as I reference. I'll watch the games this Saturday. I'll take notes, and there'll be situations where I'll be like, boy, this was a big win or a tough loss. I'm looking to play against this team next week. Or, this team really played better than the final score indicated. I think they're going to be a bit underrated. I'm looking to play them next week. So I'll have a list of 5, 10, 15 teams, but then I need to see the point spread still. And those come out Sunday night, Monday morning. That determines which games I'm going to use. So just because I like a team or I like a matchup, if the point spread isn't right, all bets are off, no pun intended, because that's what it's all about. And the point spread, as I mentioned earlier, is the great equalizer. It has gotten sharper than ever. When I started in 1996, the lines were a lot softer than they are now in 2019. So there is less value on the board. So what I like to look for, especially in big sports like college and pro football, maybe in the NCAA basketball tournament, the NBA playoffs, you have a lot of public money coming in, recreational money. You start getting line value because of this. Because keep in mind, the odds makers want the line to be accurate, but the reason they want it to be accurate is because they want balanced action. And as I referenced earlier with, trap games, a lot of times the reason those occur is because the public is heavy on one side, yet the sharp bettors like the other side. And although you might have 10 times more bets on the public side, that sharp money is 10 times heavier. So it balances out the action. So what I'd like to look for basically is games in which the public is lined up on one side and I feel they're on the wrong side, because that usually moves the line a couple points more than it should, and that gives me the value I'm looking for.
We appreciate the contribution from Mr. Nice Guy TV. DeAndre doing a nice job contributing to the channel, understanding that if everyone followed suit in a similar fashion, that we would build this out, and the 50 hours that I devote somewhere else would come here. And you talk about college football content that would be the best online. Then certainly we already deliver that, but we would even more so with guys like Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. So my next thought here is in regards to blowouts. So any game, let's say that's got a line of 20 or 21 points, 3 scores and over, I don't tend to do well in those games statistically. And then my theory is, well, let's say Ohio State's playing Rutgers and the line's 40, and Ohio State's obviously not invested, but they've got a 50-point lead in the fourth quarter, but they give up 10 points and they only win by 40, that kind of thing. Because we don't even know who's going to be on the field in the fourth quarter in those kind of games. Is Ohio State gonna are they gonna work those starters deep into the fourth quarter regardless, or are they gonna pull them early third quarter? One of those guys coming out of the game. So you don't know who's going to be on the field, even for the team that's getting drubbed. Maybe they want to get their backups in for some work. So you don't know. But then maybe the backups come in for Ohio State, and they're still better than the Rutgers first teamers. Plus, they have incentive because they never see the field to get out there and put points on the board. So maybe they even do better. So you got the issue with you don't know who's going to be in the game. You don't know what their motivation is going to be, how hard they're going to play. And number 3, you don't know how the coach is going to approach it. Is he going to say, let's put the foot on the throttle, we're going to kill them by 70 because that's our philosophy, or let's ease up, let's take a knee, let's just run the ball and we'll get out of here without getting hurt and hit the road. So that's my thought about those kind of plus 20 and over games. I believe we lost Steve. So maybe you guys are going to be unfortunately having to rest and put all your trust in my betting approach. We appreciate DeAndre's contribution. I'll check out what I see in the live chat, and we'll go from there. Because I believe Steve's hung up there, unfortunately. Once he jumps back in, then we will go from there. All right. What are you guys talking about? We got Pigskin Pete on the line. We got 863 Kane. The Auburn line. I have not looked at the Auburn line myself. I know that they're playing Tulane this week. I think it's only 17. I think I did see that. 17 points in Auburn. Auburn minus 17 at home against Tulane, coming off a difficult game against Oregon. Tulane looked really good against whomever they played last week. I don't recall the game, but they won like 42-7. They won in a big way. I don't have any gut reaction on that, except Auburn should beat Tulane by 3 to 4 touchdowns, something in that range. I would think that they should be able to cover that. But again, are they going to be let down after the big win in comeback fashion against Oregon? Do they dominate that game and lead by 28 points throughout, but then Tulane scores 2 touchdowns in the final 5 minutes and it becomes a backdoor cover? That always hurts. The other thing I wanted to discuss with Steve, and he makes a great explanation of this, is that when you're a long-term prognosticator or better, there's a difference between making a smart play and lucking into a win. Sometimes you can make a play and you can feel really good about that play, and I'll bring Steve back in. Hopefully we've got him on the line. Hey, Steve.
Hey, sorry about that. I think the
Oh, that's
internet went in
okay.
and out a little bit. Yeah,
We got you back. I was
we
trying to
got the
make
hurricane passing by. Not a
Oh,
direct,
yeah,
not
see, so you're down there in Virginia along the coast, correct?
exactly. Yeah, and
Yeah,
luckily it's going to miss us for the most part, but it's still on and off. A little wind gusts out there today, but we got power still. And we should be okay, I think.
we appreciate it. We appreciate you,
Yeah, but no, I
making
heard your
time for
question
us.
though,
So
and
the
it's
difference between
about the
being
double digit
lucky
favorites.
the
Right.
kind of the difference between, oh yeah, feeling like $1 million, like I'm the smartest guy in the world because I picked this game right, when it was kind of a backdoor cover and maybe you didn't necessarily have a good read on the game, you just lucked out, versus understanding, okay, this is a long-term process, and even though I lost this one, maybe the Auburn Oregon game would be a good example. Like you said, like you had Auburn +4 for the entire game. Auburn's or Oregon, yes,
Oregon.
had,
Yeah, right. Oregon. Right.
and then Auburn, obviously, in most instances, is going to attempt a field goal there. They go for it. 10 seconds left. They score the touchdown, get the cover and the win. Just the difference between lucking into a win versus making the smart plays over time.
Right. Well, you have to keep in mind there's two different types of bettors. Obviously, there's the recreational, as we've talked about, and there's the professional, which is the category I consider myself in because I've done this consistently now for 24 football seasons as my full-time job and my source of income. And there's no question I'd rather be accurate with a bad beat than lucky long term. With that said, you always want to win because a win is a win. But yeah, I obviously approach the results a lot differently than a recreational bettor probably would. They just care about the W's and the L's. They're not going to really be taking a long-term approach. They might just be playing during the football season. It's for fun. It's casual, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I want to make sure that I'm handicapping the games correctly. I hate losing a game like I did with Oregon. But with that said, I'd rather have Oregon and lose because I'm going to win a lot more of those plays than I'm going to lose over the course of either the next 2-3 seasons because I was on the right side. They covered 99% of the game. It was a fluke outcome. The other thing I wanted to address is before I got cut off, you're talking about the big favorites, and it's an excellent question. And as I said earlier, the only underdog I had last week was Oregon. The other 7 games I had were all basically 2, 3, 4 touchdown favorites. Went 5-2 in those games. One of the losses was by half a point. The only game that wasn't a loss by half a point was Michigan, as I referenced earlier. I was surprised by that result. Harbaugh has a tendency to really not be afraid to run up the score in week 1 against weaker teams. So there's a couple of things I look for in these games. First of all, I look for coaches' motivation. You nailed that on the head. You have to know what the coaches are looking to do. Back in the 90s when I started, the best angle in all of college football betting was playing Kansas State with Bill Snyder as a big favorite. It was eerie how he covered those numbers about 65, 70% of the time. The logic was that he knew the point spread. He wanted to win for the alumni and for the backers. So I rode that wave for many years, and I'll never forget one time he put the starters back in to get a late touchdown to cover the spread as like a 20 or 30-point favorite. And Mark, that's all I needed to know that angle was legitimate. That confirmed the angle for me. It didn't work as well when he came back, by the way, in his later years, interesting enough. But so you want to look at coaching. Paterno, when he was at Penn State, he used to play a lot of his former assistants because there's so many of them, and he would not run up the score. So that's a lot of times I'd actually look to take a big underdog because he didn't want to embarrass them. There's a big game on deck sometimes, and maybe they game plan more for that one. They don't want to risk running their starters too much. You maybe look for the underdog in that spot. But when you're playing that big favorite, you want to make sure there's motivation. There's no look ahead. They're going to keep the starters out there, as you mentioned. They're going to keep pushing the ball into the end zone. The other thing I'd like to look for, and I talked about this earlier, is I want to make sure the underdog does not have backdoor cover potential. And normally that's a team that doesn't throw the ball well. And the situation I used this past weekend, as I said, with LSU was against Georgia Southern, a triple option attack for years. You knew once they got behind, they weren't going to be able to play catch up with some last second, Hail Mary touchdown. And another example was last Thursday night. I had Clemson. They barely covered the big number because it was really inflated. And I almost stayed off it because the number was a little higher than I'd hoped. But Georgia Tech going from the triple option to a regular pro-style attack, automatic play against for me in week 1, especially against a powerhouse like Clemson. So that's some of the stuff you want to look for.
Yeah, so it's interesting when you bring up some of those oddities or nuances that you've been able to pick up on. Joe Paterno had such a lengthy career. He's playing assistants all over the place versus Bill Snyder. I would have never guessed Bill Snyder because of the elderly demeanor and because of him just being such a nice guy that he would cater to the boosters and to the alumni and run up the score because I wouldn't wouldn't. But then you mentioned him coming back and not being as successful doing that. Well, his program went from like top 10 status to more like top 30 status and wasn't as good after he came back. Jim Tressel, one of the great careers in the history of college football, if you run down the winning percentage and the championships and so forth, but was always known for keeping it close. And you would pull your hair out at times thinking this guy's got an NFL team and they're playing fill in the blank, and why aren't they beating them by 35 points and it's a 12-point game in the fourth quarter as a 25-point favorite? And those would happen with Ohio State with Tressel there. Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info. Please check him out there, prosportsinfo.com. We're going to do this each and every Friday as long as we possibly can through the college football season, through the NFL playoffs last year and Super Bowl. And we gained such great insight into Steve's expertise. Our formula last week, and I would like to get to some of the questions. And again, Steve, just cut me off at the point that you need to leave. The only thing I'm up against is 1 o'clock Eastern time USC talk. But what we did last year, and I'll look at some of the comments and questions. What we did last year is we would look at 3 big games. Steve would give you some thoughts and some things to consider on the 3 biggest games of the week, and then he would kind of select a game off the radar that might be a good play for you. So if you're prepared, I'm going to throw you 3 games, Steve, and you just let us know your thoughts on where the line stands and why. So, of course, we've got Clemson, Texas A&M, a game that was played at Texas A&M last year. The Aggies surprised many of us by staying close, almost winning the game, failed 2-point conversion. The line's about 17.5. They're at Clemson. Your thoughts about where the line stands and why?
Yeah, as I mentioned last week, I had Clemson. That was really I like Clemson, obviously. I think they're as good as anybody in the nation, but it was really a play against Georgia Tech for me last Thursday night as Georgia Tech was switching offensive styles. And that game landed within a couple points of the line. Clemson covered, but barely. And then you look at Texas A&M, they're a 34-point favorite, and they won by exactly 34 points. So, here we're talking about these big numbers and how they're tricky sometimes. The odds makers are spot on with both of these teams and their point spreads. Last week, both teams played extremely well. Clemson over 400 yards on the ground against an outmanned Georgia Tech team. And the same thing for Texas A&M, 246 yards against an outmanned Texas State team. I think both teams will have success running the ball here. The total opened 61. It's up to 63. I think both offenses move it well here, but that total looked pretty big to me. So this could be a situation you want to look at an under with 2 Class A teams. I think the line is 17 is spot on. At 17.5 or more, maybe you start leaning towards the dog. But as you mentioned last year, Clemson in a dogfight in this one, I can't imagine they're going to overlook A&M in the rematch. So I'm not looking to Fay, which maybe is the best team in the country right now. By the way, Clemson has about an 88% chance of winning this game straight up as a 17-point favorite.
And I don't think they'll look over them. Also, considering that they've got a pretty weak schedule and they only have so many teams they can overlook or mark on the schedule. And Texas A&M would be the best team on the schedule, as I see it, at least. LSU, Texas. I peg this one as the best non-conference and the most important non-conference matchup that probably involves the highest level of talent and athletes on the field. LSU coming off an impressive win, although it was Georgia Southern, as you mentioned, and they just steamrolled them. And that's not been like LSU in recent years to do that. And Texas with a decent win against Louisiana Tech in Austin. And LSU has been a pretty substantial favorite all week.
Yeah, the line's rising. They were as low as 4.5-point road favorite a few days ago. Now it's up to 6.5, and it's even getting a lift 6.5 minus $1.15, which means it's getting closer to 7. I think if you look at LSU, even though this line might seem inflated against a good Texas team, you probably want to play the 6.5 now because I do think there'll be some 7s out there on Saturday before this game kicks off. So if you like Texas, wait. The line is rising higher. You might find a +7 by Saturday. LSU is a team I had a best bet on last Saturday, easiest win of the week for me, 55-3. I mentioned there's a play against Georgia Southern, but it was also a play on LSU for me. We talk about coaches and handicapping the big spreads. Another angle I love in college football is handicapping good coaches as an underdog. Texas would fit here. There's great coaches there, but this is a situation where I think LSU might be the better team. But the other thing I'll point out is that for years, I thought LSU was a talented top 10 team, and I would stay off of them because of Les Miles. That's not a concern anymore. And I'll probably be looking to use LSU quite often this season. And I think they're flying a bit under the radar. You talk about some sleepers for the national title. I've seen them at 17-1 in some locations. If things play out right, an SEC team always has a great path to the finals. And if LSU can pull an upset or two later in conference play, there could be some value with them at 17-1 for the national title.
Yeah, Steve, I don't know if you can see the return in the comments that we're bringing onto the screen, but AB makes the comment right in line with what you're talking about concerning Tom Herman. I don't know the exact numbers, but I've heard them several times in regards to his play as an underdog and how well Texas has done. He's become maybe taking over for Urban Meyer. We cited this a number of times. Urban Meyer was an underdog at Ohio State only 8 or 9 times in 7 years, and he won the game every time as an underdog, won outright every time. And Tom Herman seems to be, he's not quite as good. He's lost a few, but like an 85% winning percentage as an underdog.
Yeah, look what he did at Houston, especially. That's why I referenced him being a great underdog coach, because he got the job at Texas because of what he did at Houston and some of the upsets. And Urban Meyer also, national titles at 2 different schools. Obviously, these are legitimate coaches, and that is a handicapping factor. That's probably one of my favorite handicapping factors in all of college football is quality coaches with good track records as an underdog. And that's what makes this game a tough call for me. And that's why I'm a little surprised the line has been rising like it has. And I agree with some of the comments that, 6.5 looks inflated. But like I said earlier, it was 4.5 a few days ago. It's 6.5 minus $1.15 in some spots. So I would not jump on 6.5. I'd hold out. You might get a +7 by this weekend. I'm big on LSU this year, but yeah, +7 looks pretty hefty, especially against a great underdog coach like Herman.
I'd like to remind everyone to join Steve Merrill over at Pro Sports Info. We're going to be here. This is our aim, to be here each and every Friday at noon to take your comments and questions, take them to air. And obviously, we're also going to be just talking stats, facts, and trends around the industry and around the previous week and what we saw and why we saw it and why the lines are what they are, and also focus on 3 of the biggest games of the week and possibly a pick that Steve has as an off-the-radar selection. We'll remind everyone that you can get my predictions by going to the link in the description section. Because it's a live stream, I don't believe it's there right now. I will get it in there, but any of the videos have the link to my Voice of College Football community. You sign up there, you get my predictions, plus a whole lot more that I've outlined elsewhere. 863 Kane, thank you so much for the contribution to the channel. We appreciate it. Many of you have caught the vision of what we're trying to do here and build the best college football channel online. Stanford USC, I don't know if that was an obvious third play. I think that the first 2 were obvious in regards to selections as games of the week. I'm selecting USC Stanford. If there's another one you'd like to hit, Steve, certainly you can go after that one. But USC and Stanford, KJ Costello is not playing. Stanford starting quarterback. They go to the former 5-star Davis Mills, who played a little bit last week against Northwestern and went 7 of 14. And speaking of Northwestern Stanford, you talk about a killer for me with that backdoor cover with a strip sack with 15 seconds left in the game, Steve. I don't know if you remember that one and how that played out for you. But USC also has to play a freshman quarterback as well in replacing JT Daniels. So Stanford and USC.
Yeah, I mean, the first thought is maybe the under here, but the odds makers are online with that because the total's around 43. Very low number, for a college football game. So I think this will be a low-scoring game. There's no reason to think it won't be after seeing, Stanford's result last week, 17-7 win against Northwestern. That total was 46.5, still stayed under. And the USC total was actually 49.5 last week, 31-23. So they did go over the total. They played pretty good offensively. 7 turnovers in that game, though. A really sloppy game. 4 by USC, 3 by Fresno. And there were 6 turnovers in the Stanford Northwestern game. So both of these teams turned the ball over a lot last week. I think that could favor the under here. I'm not big about going under 43. It's a really low number, but this should be a low-scoring game. As far as the spread, USC was briefly a 2.5-point favorite when this game opened on Sunday. Dropped instantly to -1. I don't know if that's because of the quarterback news. They thought he was playing, but then when it was announced he's not, it went from -1 to -3 instantly yesterday. So it's been about a 2-point adjustment, and USC is now a 3-point favorite. It's the most key number. About 8 to 9% of the time in college football, a team is going to win by exactly 3 as a 3-point favorite. So I think the odds look pretty sharp here. I'd still lean under, although there's not a lot of value at this point at 43.
So, Steve, AB online is telling us that a Texas A&M player guaranteed the win. So I think we all should run out bet the money line on the Aggies. It's guaranteed. He's Joe Namath.
I was just going to say the opposite. That'll wake Clemson up. We go heavy on Clemson now. See, I was thinking the exact opposite when you said that.
Obviously, I got a bit of a tongue in cheek that we should be listening to 18-year-olds making predictions when they got to go out there with 50 other dudes that they can't control how well they're going to play. They're not tennis players. They're not boxers that control the game by themselves. We got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. He just gave us great insight all over the board. It's just amazing to me because it's so fascinating and interesting. And Steve, if you can, to some degree, and we just had another contribution come in, so we appreciate that. Steve, in regards to when people know what you do and meet you for the first time, or come on a show like this and join the live chat, you know what's going through their minds. This guy's the luckiest guy in the world. This guy crunches numbers and bets on games and is just absorbed in football first and foremost, and then basketball, baseball, all the other sports. But this time of year, it's all about football. And we just feel like you just live in paradise.
Yeah, there's worse things to do, obviously. And I've always said if you're going to do something, you do this as well, Mark. Do something you love. Focus on an industry or a career in which you enjoy going to work each day. The one downside to this line of work, obviously, is that there's no days off except for the day before and after the baseball All-Star game. And they've even taken that away from me because there's odds on the home run derby now on Monday night. So I get that Wednesday off, the day after the All-Star game, which is when they do the ESPYs, of course, because it's the only day off in sports for anybody in the major sports. That's why the ESPYs are always the day after the baseball All-Star game. But one thing I will say, the one downside to this is you become numb kind of to special teams. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area during the 80s, during the heyday of the Redskins, went to all the playoff games, went to games for 10, 15 years straight. I haven't cared about a Redskins as a fan for 10 to 15, 20 years now. Of course, it's been very easy since Dan Snyder took over because they've been miserable. But I'll root against them in a heartbeat if I've got the other side. So that's the one thing is, you can't be a fan anymore when you're in this line of work. Not sure that's a good or bad thing. I think my life's probably been a little bit better not being a Redskin fan for the last 20 years.
Absolutely.
But that's the one trade-off. You can't be a homer. You got to look at everything from a statistical angle. And I think that's where a lot of recreational bettors get in trouble. I can't relate to this, but I know a lot of people play their favorite team every week. And I can't relate to that because I'll play against them as fast as I would play them. And I feel like a lot of times you can actually do well knowing your favorite team, but you got to know when to fade them. You probably have as good of a feel for certain teams if you follow them than as the professionals do. But you can't get married to them. You can't be in love with them. You can't be afraid to go the other way.
So fortunately for you, Steve, you were a fan during the good times with the Redskins during the 80s and 90s, and then you backed off and became a professional and became numb to it during the downtime. So that kind of worked out for you, at least from that angle.
Yeah, and the other story I'll use, too, is I was a huge Washington Capitals fan in the 80s, and I went to tons of games where they eliminated by the Penguins, at home in games 5 or 6, and half Cap Center was Pittsburgh fans or New York Ranger fans or Flyer fans. In the early 2000s, I kind of gave up on the Caps. They got really bad for a while. That's actually why they were able to draft Ovechkin #1. I don't handicap hockey, so, I have no dog in that fight. I could have rooted for the Caps, but I kind of gave up on them. Started to follow them when they were the #1 seed back in like 2010, I think. Friend of mine got me back into following them when they were really good, the #1 team in the league. They had a 3-1 series lead against the Canadiens and lost 3 straight to the 8th seed, who were eliminated. And I told him, this is exactly why I gave up on the Capitals, and I'm done. And I didn't watch another game actually until last year when they made the Stanley Cup Finals. I ended up watching all those games. I felt a little guilty that I was getting into it again, and then I realized how the dues I'd paid in the 80s and 90s with them. So, yeah, the Redskins were a good team to follow. The Capitals were a little rough, but definitely getting off of both of those teams in the early 2000s made my life a lot less stressful, even doing what I do.
Absolutely. Steve, I can relate to you separating yourself as a professional because I've experienced that. And I have maintained such a strong connection to being a fan more so than the people around me. So I've been in the industry for 28 years. And then on top of that at ESPN for 18 years. And I see it and hear it every day where people are fans of teams. But once you get into that work environment, it's like, let's just get this. I know my baseball team's down 7-5, but I don't want them to come back. It's going to lengthen the game. We need to get off to the next show. Let's get this thing off the air. And people become completely numb to their own teams and their home teams. And it's just like, we're working this job. I don't want this game to go another inning. Lose the game. I don't care. It's my team. And it's funny because we joke about that all the time.
Yeah,
That
the one thing I'll point out too, Mark, I think it's changed for me is regular season games. It's really hard for me to get into a regular season game, especially like in baseball. And I grew up in the DC area before we had the Nationals, so I was an Orioles fan. And this is back when you'd have 4 TV channels, no cable TV. I'd listen to games on the radio at night.
oh,
And I look
yeah.
back on that, I'm listening to a regular season Orioles game on the radio.
Oh, me too.
You couldn't pay me to watch a regular season Orioles game now on TV. So, yeah, I think that's what changes too when you do what I do and what you do. When you're around sports every day, the games lose its aura a little bit, the regular season games. But then again, the postseason, I love the postseason in every sport. So I love games that matter. And that's what I love about college football. We're talking about those games we just mentioned today, especially the LSU Texas A&M game. Those games matter. I mean, these are basically playoff games in week 2. And there is no other sport, even the NFL, in which a week 2 game can have as much meaning as it does in college football. It's the only sport in which that's possible. And that's one of the reasons I love college football.
James Kane, we thank you so much for the contribution. And I remind people from time to time that you can contribute in so many ways. Likes, comments, share, subscribe. We've got 13,000 subscribers we just hit the other day. So that's because of you. And we expect to be at 20,000 by the end of the year. So thank you so much for the contribution. But if you catch the vision here, if everybody throws in a buck or two all the time, then I'm doing this full throttle all the time. And that's the aim and that's the goal. Before we get your pick of the week, Steve, there was a comment made on here that confuses some fans that aren't into betting, but they just see the level of play and the two teams and wonder, why is that spread like that? So our example from this week in week 2 is Syracuse coming off a fine 10-3 season, won a bowl game, top 15 team last year. Going to Maryland, 5-7. Sure, they get the blowout win, but they're playing Howard last week. So there seems to be a discrepancy on the surface from these two programs. But when they hit the field, Maryland's a bit of a favorite at home. Just kind of explain why, from a football standpoint, it seems like, wow, Syracuse should be a favorite. But in fact, that's not the case.
Yeah, and this could actually be what we could call the trap game this week. I talked about trap games being situations where the average, fan really likes one side, doesn't understand why the line is so short. And then on top of that, if the line is actually moving the other way with actual sharp money, those are really what I would coin as trap games. So this one might qualify this week because Syracuse not only opened as a 2.5-point favorite, but they're now +1. So not only did that line look low, but it's actually moved towards Maryland. And that sharp money early in the week moving that number. So yeah, this looks like a sharp square divide. I like to say that term when the public is on one side, the sharp money is on the other side. I would say Maryland qualifies this week, so we'll keep an eye on this game. It's a tough call because it is early for both teams, and they both played really, cupcakes last week. 79-0 win by Maryland. They were only a 30-point favorite, but still, it's hard to take much away from that. Meanwhile, Syracuse and Liberty, 24-0. They were about a 20-point favorite in that game, so that was pretty much in line. What I love, though, is look at the rush defenses. Both teams allowed 1 and -4 yards last week. So they basically have a 0.0 yards per rush defense. So it'll really be the key to me. It'll be which team runs the ball better. I think Maryland actually might have the better rushing attack, and I think that's one of the reasons we've seen some money come in on them from the sharp bettors.
So you'll appreciate the Mark Rippon comment in the comments section after we talked about the Redskins. Of course, Joe Gibbs famously winning 3 Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks, Doug Williams and Joe Theismann, of course, getting to 4 Super Bowls, and Mark Rippon, the last one against the Bills. All right, Steve, we appreciate you giving us so much time. I would love, if you have it in you, and this was the format last year, but I kind of surprised Steve this year. We made connection, but just brought him on, and we didn't preface anything. But we will hit the 3 big games each week as decided by Steve and myself. So this week it was LSU, Texas, Clemson, Texas A&M, and also Stanford, USC. So if you missed part of the live stream, and as is typically the case, we have the most people on the line near the end of the segment. Go back and watch the whole thing once it posts to my channel. Also, check out Steve at Pro Sports Info, definitely, and get locked in on his products and services there. But if you've got an oddball pick, it's usually an under the radar, something like Tulsa and UTEP are playing or something like that, that you unveil for us, Steve, if you've got anything like that this week.
Yeah, this isn't a high-profile game, but it's a team we've talked about a few times. It's a game I'm taking a look at right now. We'll see where the line settles. I mentioned that bad beat with Oregon last week as a 4-point dog, basically covered from start to finish until the end. I think they bounce back this week, and it's also a play against Nevada for me. That's another game we've referenced a few times. Nevada, an 11-point home dog last week. They pulled the upset against Purdue 34-31, but they had a 5-0 turnover edge, and they only won by 3 points. If you're normally plus 5 turnovers at home, you're winning by more than 3 points. So I think Nevada could be a little bit overrated because of that. You look at their statistics last week. They were terrible in the passing game. They gave up over 8 yards per pass to Purdue. They only threw the ball for 5.5 yards. Meanwhile, Oregon, although they should have covered that game, it might have been fortunate because they really got dominated in the line of scrimmage. Auburn outrushed them 206-90. That's another reason why it didn't bother me too much losing at the last second, because I really felt like on the line of scrimmage, Oregon was beaten pretty badly. But what I did like was the passing attack, both offense and defense. Oregon completed 76% of their passes last week. They allowed just 41%. I know they're taking on a true freshman quarterback, so that's part of the reason. But the passing attack looks to be a huge edge for Oregon this week. And when taking a big favorite, I like teams that can throw the ball and extend the lead against a team like Nevada that cannot throw the ball. And I mentioned that earlier. When taking big favorites, I want underdogs that cannot play from behind. So I think Oregon's worth a bounce back look here. Line open 23. It was sitting at 24 today. I've seen it now go to 24.5 in some spots. So it's getting a bit pricey. 24 or less, so if you still have that number out there, go ahead and play it now because I think Oregon can win big.
Hey, Steve, if I can keep you on the line for just another minute, we've got a comment coming in concerning the Florida State, Louisiana Monroe, and not that you can necessarily break that down, but Florida State being an interesting case, and we've talked about it many times. Clemson, Alabama, the gold standard. Then that next tier is Ohio State, Georgia, Oklahoma, where you just have so much trust in those teams. Here's a team in Florida State where the talent tells us that they're not at the level of those teams, but they should be playing so much better. They blow it against Boise State as a 7-point home favorite, true home favorite that was 5.5 in Jacksonville, from what I remember. And now they're playing Louisiana Monroe. They're a 21-point favorite. What do you do with some of these just wild card teams? And they seem to be in a different category all unto themselves as a top 15 recruited team. The whole roster's top 15 talent, and they're just playing like garbage. And it continues now into 13 games of Willie Taggart's tenure.
Yeah, one thing about these teams like, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, they're good offensively, but they're always dominant defensively. And Florida State was like that for so many decades when they were a top 5, perennial top 5 team. And now you look at, as you mentioned, a 7-point favorite. They lose out to Boise, but not only did they lose, they gave up 36 points. They gave up 621 yards last week. You don't just fix that problem overnight. Now, I don't think Louisiana Monroe is going to be a great offensive team this year, but they did put up 500 yards last week. So I'd be very careful with Florida State here. My normal instinct would be, hey, they bounce back. They were embarrassed. This line has actually gone from 21 to 22.5. But boy, I don't know. A team that gains 500 yards is playing a team that allowed 600. They're getting over 3 touchdowns. I'd be very careful. I think the only way you probably play is Monroe. I think Florida State's obviously the more talented team, but I've been very careful with them the last few seasons. And another point I'll bring up about winning long-term in sports betting, the one edge you have over the odds makers is that you don't have to play every game, but they have to put a line on every game. And that's where I've done very well over the past 3 decades, is picking my spots, trying to find those 3 or 4 gems each Saturday in college football. And there's some games I just instantly get rid of because of the uncertainty. I don't like uncertainty, and I would say Florida State's about as uncertain as they come right now.
And Vegas doesn't like uncertainty, and I think that's one of the reasons why we saw Florida, Miami with similar talent on the roster. You had the proven quarterback, the proven coach on one side, and that's why it's a 7.5-point line going into the game. Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. It's been amazing. You provide so much insight and information, and we encourage everyone to get over to prosportsinfo.com. We're going to have Steve's take on 3 huge games of the week, plus a kind of under the radar selection from him. Plus, we just talk trends and bets and lines and what the industry looks like each and every week with Steve. Thanks, Steve. We appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Mark.
Great to have Steve on. We want to remind everyone that we're turning around this live stream in just a few seconds. If you missed anything from this hour, go back and watch the rest, because it's always fun to talk to Steve, and I could pick his brain for hours on this stuff, because I would love to improve my 16-11 against the spread from last week. Although 59% makes you money, and it made me money, and also I make it tough on myself by predicting all the top 25 games, regardless. Even if I don't like that game, don't think it's a good play, and just think, man, Vegas has that number right where I would want it, I still pick all the games just because once I get into a regiment, it's tough to knock me out of it. We're talking USC football, USC, Stanford. You talk about a better, maybe a bettor's nightmare. A bettor's nightmare with two backup quarterbacks playing and one a true freshman. USC and Stanford. We're talking USC football taking on the Cardinal in just a few seconds. So keep it locked in here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. But it will be a new live stream. Keep it locked in on this page. We're turning it around in just a couple minutes. Then at 2 o'clock, Nebraska Talk. Navy Thomas, are you listening? 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. We got Nebraska Talk for you right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. See you in about 30 seconds.